The topic today is carbon farming for successful vineyard systems. In the past few years, you may have heard some trendy buzzwords like carbon farming, no-till farming, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, resilient agriculture, and the liquid carbon pathway. Today we have brought together a few experts to share their knowledge on the topic that these buzzwords were based off of. I want to introduce our guests. First of all, I'm Dan Rinke from Johan Vineyards. I'm moderating today. And then we have Corey Owens, who is the state soil scientist and soil health coordinator for USDA's National Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS. They have a booth down below just outside the trade show, and you should all stop by and say hi to her afterwards. Corey leads the Technical Soil Services program across the state, which includes helping farmers, ranchers, and foresters learn how healthy soils can help them. Corey completed her undergraduate work in crop soil science at OSU and her graduate work at University of California, Davis, earning an MS in soil science. Next, we'll have David Montgomery speak. David is a MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington. He is an internationally recognized geologist who studies landscape evolution and the effects of geological processes on ecologic systems and human societies. David is an author of award-winning popular science books, including Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soils Back to Life, and The Hidden Half of Nature, the microbial roots of life and health. David has been featured in documentary films, network and cable TV, and has been on a wide variety of TV and radio programming, including Nova, PBS NewsHour, Fox and Friends, and All Things Considered. And then finally, we have on our panel Carl Moore. Most of you guys know him. He's been in the Oregon wine industry for the past 13 years, working in many different capacities, from crew leader to vit tech and viticulturalist, and currently is viticulturalist for Atlas Vineyard Management Company. That's enough from me. I want to get our panelists up and get them speaking because they have a lot of interesting things to say. So we're going to hear from Corey to start.
Good morning, everyone. Like you, I am very much looking forward to hearing from Dr. Montgomery in his presentation on soils and carbon farming. And I'm really here just to plug, if any of the information or the farming practices that he mentions sparks your interest, I welcome you to consider the Natural Resources Conservation Service. How many of you guys have heard of the NRCS? Show of hands. So many of you, that's fantastic. All right, so then you all probably know that the USDA NRCS has been America's private land conservation agency since 1935. We made a name for ourselves during the Dust Bowl, where we helped folks overcome the devastating soil erosion that was destroying farmland. And we've never stopped working with farmers, ranchers, and foresters conserving soil. That has been our bread and butter since then. In 2012, we refocused our ongoing soil quality efforts into our contemporary soil health initiative. So that, along with what you might be familiar with, which is our soil surveys, our soil maps, where we help people understand why soils are where they are, why they look like they look. Now with soil health, we're helping people understand why they function like they function, how soils work, and how understanding how soils work can help you make great management decisions so soil can work for you. In Oregon, we have offices in all of our counties, and we have folks who are happy to chat with any of you about any soil conservation measures you're interested in. And we also have, as Dan mentioned, a booth here outside the exhibit hall where we've got all kinds of fact sheets and booklets and pamphlets and contact information for our folks here in the Willamette Valley who would love to chat with you about what soil conservation means for you and what the NRCS can do for you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Montgomery.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm very happy with the turnout and the interest in soil health and with carbon farming in the wine world. I'm going to basically try and give you an overview today of why a geologist would be invited to come talk to a group like you. I'm somebody who has studied soils and soil erosion primarily in natural environments over a career that spans a few decades working all around the world. And in that time, I've come to actually spend nights and weekends writing the 3 books that are up there on the screen now. Dirt was the one that looks backwards at the effect of the way that people treated their land, how that affected civilizations throughout history. The middle one is sort of the key to how carbon farming could work, the role of microbial life in the soil in building soil organic matter and building soil fertility. It's the sort of the new science behind this stuff. And the Growing Revolution, the most recent one, is how that can be applied in agronomic systems to actually regenerate healthy, fertile soils as a consequence of intensive farming. There's ties to the wine world, but I'm going to try and take you through the arc of these 3 books, and I'm going to try and do it in record time. So forgive me if I seem to go a little fast. I'm trained as a professor, so I can do that, but I have a lot that I'd like to talk about, 10 years worth of nights and weekend writing in a few minutes. But what I want to do is give you that sense of that overview, and I'll reiterate to talk to local experts, consultants in the NRCS if you want to try and apply some of the methods that I'll get to in the end as central to rebuilding soil health, because they need to be adapted to different regions. They need to be adapted to different crops. They need to be adapted to your farm, your vineyard. But let me start with why somebody like me would be so concerned about the state of the world's soils. There's a report that came out almost 5 years ago now, called the UN State of the Soil Assessment, that in the executive summary synthesized the most sort of critical salient feature of their global review of the state of the world's soils, and that's that we're continuing to degrade them. We're losing about 0.3% of our net agricultural production capacity each and every year to ongoing soil loss and soil erosion. So the problem of soil erosion that really led to the establishment of the Soil Erosion Service that became the Soil Conservation Service that became the Natural Resource Conservation Service. The problem is not solved at a global level, but it's down to a rate that 0.3%, that's kind of a small number, right? Until you think about playing that out over the next 100 years. At 0.3% played out over the next 100 years, that amounts to we're on track to lose about 1/3 of our agricultural production capacity at a global scale when our population is slated to rise by about 1/3. Those problems are working at odds with one another. And if you look at the amount of land that we've degraded on a global scale, we've already degraded about 1/3 of the world's cropland to the point where it's not in production anymore. In other words, we need to change agriculture this century if we're going to feed people in the next century. That's why a geologist like myself would be concerned about this problem. Now, I'm going to walk you through the summary of the book that got me started in thinking about the problem of soil erosion. And the backstory is that working on problems of soil erosion around the world on things like, what shapes the Cascades, what makes the meanders and rivers, where do stream channels begin, problems that are fundamentally about how erosion works in natural systems, I had the privilege to work on most of the continents and noticed a connection between the degraded state of soils and the impoverished state of the people living in different landscapes. There were connections, in other words, between the state of the land and the state of human societies. And that got me into writing this book that looked backwards at the state of how, well, not the state of, but how the processes that shaped soils today through ancient land use influenced human societies. And so what I basically did is I reviewed evidence for soil erosion around the world and came up with the conclusion that it was not an original conclusion, it's been reported by others, that soil erosion actually contributed to undermining civilizations around the world, starting with the earliest agricultural civilizations in Mesopotamia, in classical Greece, Rome, the southern United States, Neolithic or Bronze Age Europe. The list is actually pretty long, and I tried to catalog those in the Dirt book. But what I found was not the usual story that you find in environmental history textbooks. which is that deforestation led to erosion, which undermined civilizations. What I found is it was basically very different. It was the plow that did it. There was actually, the villain of this tale was tillage. And if you think about why that is, and you think about it from the framing of how soils are made from breaking down rocks and merging them with soil organic matter, and how soils are eroded on even the slightest slope, you're going to be eroding soils for some time. You can think about soils as having a balance between production and loss. They're just like our bank accounts. And you can think about soils as essentially the natural capital that finances civilizations through growing our food and our wine and whatever else we want to consume growing out of the soil. But soils are produced at a pace, they're lost at a pace. And if we're eroding them faster than we're rebuilding them, then we're doing just the same thing that I've demonstrated several times in my life. By spending money faster than I make it for long enough, I've run out of money. It's really kind of simple. We can do that at a civilization scale with our soils. And you can do it at a farm scale with the fertility of your land as well. And it was the invention of the plow that really started off the cycles of land degradation that I talked about in the dirt book. And so what is it about the plow that actually leads to the degradation of soil? Well, it's sort of two things. It's designed to invert the soil. It's incredibly good weed control, right? That's why it's often used in organic systems in particular as weed control, because it basically turns those nasty weeds upside down and makes fertilizer out of them. But tillage also accelerates the breakdown of the soil organic matter in the soil by stimulating microbial activity, and it basically draws down the batteries of the soil, in effect, by degrading soil organic matter. And it also leaves the soil bare and vulnerable to erosion by water or wind until the next crop comes in, whether it's a weed or a crop or a cover crop. And if that goes on for long enough, you can actually lose the soil off of the surface as a physical body, or you can degrade the organic matter content of it enough to actually affect the fertility of the soil in ways that play into the health of your crops. Now, this one photograph up here now, taken back in 1970, of the Palouse in eastern Washington really captures why a geologist like myself would consider tillage to be so environmentally destructive. You'll notice that there's lots of little channels carved into that field. This is a winter wheat field over in the Palouse. It was farmed in that sort of traditional winter wheat fallow rotation, and this is obviously in the fallow period. There's no crops growing out on the soil at the present, but it illustrates what happens if you get a good rainstorm right after you plow. Those little channels get cut into the landscape. We call them rills in geology because you can basically erase them with a single pass of the plow. They're an agronomic nuisance, but they can really add up if they basically keep happening year after year. And that's illustrated by this next slide, also from the Palouse. And you could find similar kind of photographs from other parts of the country as well. I like these because they're in my backyard, in effect, in a geopolitical sense, and they're dramatic. This photograph illustrates the magnitude of the effect of what tillage can do over 50 years. That fence in the upper right-hand corner is a fence that the farmer built around their water cistern when the land was up at that upper orange bar in 1911, when the grass was first broken, and then it was farmed in winter wheat in that wheat fallow rotation for 50 years. And notice that little cliff below that fence. The land is now down at about that lower orange bar. So how big a deal is this? That's a 5-foot cliff. It's a little hard to tell, but there's a stadia rod that's kind of washed out on the negative. It's a 5-foot cliff. That's 5 feet of erosion in 50 years. That's about a foot every decade. That translates out to about an inch a year. There's nowhere on earth that soil forms that fast, except my wife's garden and some farms I visited. Nature doesn't build soil that fast. But in case you're already starting to get depressed, and the depressing part of the talk is not over, we're going to go deeper. We will come out of the hole, because it turns out that we can actually turn around this process. But I hope you're sitting there thinking, well, Dave, isn't this a really extreme example? And the short answer is, well, of course it is. That's why I use it. It's the most extreme example I could find. You should be asking the question of, how typical is it? How fast are the world's soils eroding? And that's exactly the question I came to in writing the dirt book. Because when you study sort of the problem of soil loss in classical Greece or in ancient Rome and how it contributed to the decline of farming in those communities that eventually undermined their empires, you basically don't have the benefit of scientific journals where people are out measuring the flux of sediment off of farmed fields and reporting it diligently in the peer-reviewed literature. There's only 4 books that survive from Roman days that even mention agriculture. When you go back to Greek days, you're dealing with spotty, weird quotes out of Plato and a few others. There's not a lot. So what I did to answer that question of how typical is that kind of pace of soil degradation is I went to this modern scientific literature and tried to vacuum up every bit of data I could find about how fast are the world's farms and vineyards eroding at a global scale. I did this in the summer when my grad students were off doing stuff, and I spent basically a month in the library. I could have gotten more data, but I integrated about 1,500 different studies to come up with the numbers that are on this slide. That number at the top there in red, that's the pace, the median, the average rate of soil loss off of conventionally plowed farms globally. So it integrates everything from peasant agriculture in the developing world to modern, fully technological, mechanized agriculture in the Great Plains. And the numbers in parentheses up there show you how many peer-reviewed academic studies I averaged to get the number on the right. In other words, don't do this. It takes a lot of time and effort. I have boxes full of the Xerox papers. The point, though, is that 1.5 millimeters of average erosion rate for the world's farmland sounds like a pretty small number. I mean, your fingernails grow faster than 1.5 millimeters a year. The San Andreas Fault moves 10 times faster than that. But when you play that out, it only takes 20 years to erode off an inch of soil at that pace. And 20 years is a geological instant. Now, those blue numbers in the middle are the paces that natural systems tend to erode. Erosion rates under natural vegetation is that upper blue number. It's at 1% of a millimeter a year. Rates of soil production is how fast nature builds soils, 2% of a millimeter a year. The long-term, the geological erosion rates, how fast the continents erode over millions of years. About the same numbers, the pace that the world erodes under native vegetation and how fast nature builds soils. And that's comforting because we know that most of the world outside of really arid zones is covered in soil. And if soil's eroded faster than they were built for long enough, when you have geological time to play with, there wouldn't be any soil left. And conversely, if soil built faster than it's being eroded, we'd be buried under the stuff. Forget that that's a horrible pun. But the key number up there is that one on the bottom. That blue one for no-till farming. It's a lot more like those blue numbers than that red number. It's an order of magnitude or more, about 20-fold lower than the pace at which the world's farmlands are eroding. In other words, the problem with long-term soil degradation is not that we farm. That would be a horrible conclusion to come to. If that was the case, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you. I'd be at home drinking lots of wine or scotch or something in the basement all the time. The problem is the way we've been farming. And tillage has been a major destructive element in human history. So far, I've given you all the data you need to calculate for yourself the average longevity of an agricultural civilization. Basically, if you take that net soil loss of about 1 millimeter a year, and I could argue for 1.5 millimeters, that applies that you could erode off a 0.5 meter to 1 meter thick soil, sort of a 1.5 to 3 foot thick soil, the average soil thickness on hill slopes around the world. It would only take 500 to 1,000 years. Now, one of the things I found when I wrote that dirt book is the average longevity of most agricultural civilizations is, guess what? About 1,000 years, plus or minus 50%, and as a geologist, I think that's precise. But I also hope you're thinking about, well, what about, places like the Tigris and Euphrates? Haven't they farmed there for thousands of years? What about the Nile? They farmed there for thousands of years. The Indus and the Brahmaputra in India, the rivers of lowland China, these are all places where people have farmed for thousands of years and maintained civilizations. What's the common element among all those places I just mentioned? Basic physical geography. They're all floodplains. And what is it that happens on a floodplain? It floods. And what do floods bring? Sediment, silt, sand, tires, school buses, whatever is coming down the river off your neighbor's places. And how thick is a single grain of sand? It's about 0.5 millimeter to 2 millimeters thick is the technical definition. On average, call it 1 millimeter or so. In other words, if you're in a major floodplain where you haven't built dams and levees to actually prevent the flooding from happening, you can deposit about what the plow will take away on average each year. So you can maintain farming in those kind of environments in perpetuity because nature's fixing the damage of the plow. When you start to move, the big message of the dirt book is when you start to move farming up onto the hillsides, if you till, you've started the clock ticking on burning through the fertility of your land and its ability to maintain productivity. That is the real message of Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. And this concludes the depressing part of the talk. Because what I started to ask myself when I got to the finish, well, it actually took a while. It took me 3 times to write the last chapter of that book, so I would be happy with it. But I started thinking about the question of, could we actually reverse this historical pattern? And this is where it starts to get interesting and relate to modern agronomy and enology. Could we actually reverse the historical pattern of soil loss and rebuild healthy, fertile soils as a consequence of intensive farming? And I started to learn that in probably one of the most unusual places for a geologist to do field work, and that is my wife's garden right outside the back door. Because as I was finishing writing Dirt, we bought a house. I got tenure at the University of Washington where I teach, and we bought a house in North Seattle, and Anne had always wanted a garden. She's a biologist, and so when you think about, how do you actually make healthy, fertile soils, it's the marriage of geology and biology. We were perhaps, destined to write this book, but she basically took it on herself to try and restore fertility to the land that we bought in North Seattle. Because this shows you our side yard, which when it had what I call a old-growth Seattle lawn, 6 inches of tangled roots. When we pulled that off, we realized that we'd bought a lemon. We basically had horrible soil. This was not the rich, thick, black earth that a gardener would like to find when you pull off that lawn in the yard. And the only good news with the idea that I didn't think to dig a soil pit in my own yard when I bought a house. I've dug soil pits all over the world. You'd think to do one in your own yard before you plunk down a lot of money to buy a Seattle house. Well, the good news is that Ann didn't think to do that either, so I'm off the hook. So we pulled this lawn off the yard, and we go, okay, we've basically got the mineral part of soil, but we don't have the biology. We don't have the organic matter. There wasn't a single worm underneath that lawn when we pulled it out. No visible life forms. There were probably a few starving bacteria and fungi down there. And the biologist decided that what we needed was the biology. And she was right. So she took it on herself to essentially do what we termed her organic matter crusade, going to the neighbors and raking up their leaves in the fall. But the price was we got to keep them. They didn't get them. So their trees were desperately throwing off leaves in the fall, and they were going over to fertilize our trees. We basically entered. Seattle has a zoo that every year holds what's a lottery for what they call Zoo Doo, which you can guess what that is. It's the composted herbivore turds in the Seattle Zoo. We entered that one year. Our postcard got drawn. We won. So Ann took my truck down, filled it up with Zoo Doo, came back. Next year she entered again. We won. 3 years in a row, we won. We finally figured out that everybody always wins the Zoo Doo lottery. And it makes great fertilizer. So basically, we started adding compost and mulch. We didn't dig anything in because we were busy professionals, and basically we were just trying to add stuff to the yard. And we started noticing that the compost we'd add in the fall would be gone by the spring, so we'd add more. The stuff we added in the spring would be gone by the fall. We kept adding. Ann's mantra was, well, if the soil's hungry, we're going to keep feeding it. We didn't really understand soil ecology at that point. Ann was trained as the kind of biologist who studies salmon. She was a macrobiologist. I was a geologist. Living things are a mystery to me, especially people. We'll get there later. But this basically shows you the results of all her composting and mulching in our yard over the course of about 10 years. The soil in my right hand there, that's what we started with. The soil in my left hand is what we have as of about 3 years ago. It's even improved a little bit. But we started off with about 1% organic matter, which is really low. And we ended up today, we're up to about 10% across most of the yard. Under the lawn, it's more like 6%. And the veggie beds where we've added biochar and all our kitchen scraps, it's more like about 12%. But the point is we've increased it by almost 1% a year and sustained that over 10 years to the point where we actually put tons of carbon in our yard, unintentionally. It took us a few years to start noticing the changes, but the changes are very real. So we started looking into what was behind these changes, and we realized as we got into studying the literature on microbial ecology and what builds soil organic matter, that we were not the ones doing all the hard work. There's plenty of work to source and transport and spread that organic matter, but the real work was going on underground by trillions of microorganisms that we were in effect feeding. And what we discovered is in this zone called the rhizosphere, which is Greek for area around the roots of a plant, it's one of the most life-dense areas on the planet. We tend to think of biologically diverse things like the Amazon or the Serengeti, or these large things that we can imagine with our scale. If you want to find the densest population of life on Earth, go look around the roots of a healthy plant and healthy fertile soil. Most dense area on the planet. And what's happening down there is that the plants are actually engaging in what Ann and I call a biological bazaar. There's all this trading going on between plants and the microbial life in the soil. And so that blow up there on the screen now is a blow up of a root zone around the rhizosphere. And it was triggered, us looking into this was triggered by us finding peer-reviewed papers in the literature that talked about how plants would exude out of their roots up to 30 or 40% of the material they capture through photosynthesis. How many of us actually sort of take 30 to 40% of our income and just go spread it around somewhere? Well, there's taxes, right? But in principle, at least, we get something for them. So what are plants doing by doing all that effort to actually photosynthesize and then pushing out carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, sugars, fats, and proteins out of their roots? What does that sound like? It sounds like food, doesn't it? They're pushing meals out of their roots, and they're doing it to feed the microbes that live in that rhizosphere. And those exudates, as they're called, things exuded by the plants, disappear within about 1 millimeter to 1 centimeter of the roots, and they get taken up by microbes, whether they're fungi or bacteria, that are actually sort of around there. And it kind of works the way that if you put out pizza and beer, free pizza and beer on a college campus, what do you think happens? Students magically appear. It's kind of the same around the roots of a plant. If you put out basically nourishment, you're setting an underground buffet, and the microbes come. And it turns out that plants will put out specially tailored exudates to try and get things that they want from those microbes. They're very deliberate, it seems, if you can use that word with a plant, in terms of who they're trying to recruit to live around their roots. And why is that? Because those exudates get consumed, and what does any living organism do with something it consumes? It metabolizes it, and it produces waste products. It converts it into something else and gets something out of it in the exchange, usually energy or some useful molecule. And so those microbial metabolites turn out to be things like indole-3 acetic acid, which is one of the botanical world's big growth hormones. So think about that for a minute. You've got microbes living around the roots of a plant, consuming sugars that the plant is producing, and it's converting them into growth hormones so that plant can get bigger to capture more photosynthetic energy to produce more exudates. It's a positive symbiosis. It's a positive or virtuous reinforcement cycle. This is why when you go out and look at most plants, almost all of our crops form symbioses with mycorrhizal fungi and with bacterial communities in the soil that we're only now learning to understand how they really work. 30, 40 years ago, this stuff was crazy talk. Now it's in all the journals. It's how nature works. And if you go back, putting my geologist hat on for a second, if you go back and look at the earliest fossils that we have of land plants, they have mycorrhizal fungi wrapped around the roots. These relationships are as old as plants on land. They're older than the pollinator and flowering plant kind of relationships that we all know about. But we've not known about these because they're out of sight, they're out of mind, they're in that hidden half of nature that we can't detect with our senses and that's below ground. But it actually is very important for things like the health of crops. And to sort of summarize a whole lot that we wrote about in the hidden half of nature into a single slide, understanding those relationships, those symbiotic relationships between soil microbiota and plants, leads you to sort of thinking about two very different diets for feeding a plant. Now, when I started working on this kind of stuff, I didn't think about plants having a diet. I'm now absolutely convinced they have diets, and their dietary intake is as important for their health as what we eat is for ours. And so you can think of plants in terms of feeding them a fertilizer diet, where if you feed a plant a whole lot, you can grow. We all know that if you feed a plant enough fertilizers, enough N, P, and K, you can get big yields out of plants growing in even crappy soils. We could have done this in our yard had we chosen to go that route, but Anne had different ideas for what to do with our yard. But what happens is when plants get all the major elements they need for growth, they stop investing in their root system, and they stop investing in exudates, which means they're not getting as many of the mineral micronutrients that those microbial partners are providing to them, things like zinc and copper that they need for health and to build their defensive systems. And then they don't get the beneficial microbial metabolites as well. Whereas if you grow plants in healthy, fertile soils that have more organic matter to feed those microbes, you can get comparable growth, but you also get the beneficial mineral micronutrients and beneficial microbial metabolites. On the book we're working on now, we're basically showing that this is basically the reason why the global sales of pesticides went through the roof after global sales of chemical fertilizers went through the roof. We dismantled the defensive systems of our plants. There's parallels in what goes on with the human diet and the human microbiome and chronic diseases. That's the second half of the hidden half of nature that I'm not really talking about today. But obviously I refer you to. They are the same system. What goes on in our gut is the inverse of what goes on in the roots of the plant. You can just go down the checklist and go, yep, it's the same system. It's just your convention of what's inside and what's outside the host differs. Plants do all this stuff in the root zone outside. They've outsourced it. We've internalized it. But going into all this basically made me question, well, could you do the kind of thing Ann did to our yard at scale on fully operational, profitable farms? Because it's one thing to basically take truckloads of Zoodoo and rebuild the soil in an urban lot in a city on a small lot. It's a whole other thing to try and do it on a farm, as you all know. So I took about 6 months off from teaching at the University of Washington and traveled around the world to interview farmers who had already rebuilt the health and fertility of their land and basically asked them the question that they almost universally said no academic had ever asked them, which is like, how did you do it? What are you doing? They were surprised that I wasn't there to tell them how to do it. But again, I have a brown thumb. Ann is the gardener in our family. I went on a listening tour, in other words, and I basically visited farms in equatorial Africa, Central America, all across North America. And what I found was a common recipe for rebuilding healthy, fertile soils that worked over short time scales. And by when a geologist says short time scales, I'm talking years to a decade. Which can be long on your place if you think that way, but to me it's like almost instantaneously. And those principles basically boil down to the principles of conservation agriculture, which the UN has summarized as these three principles. Minimal or no disturbance of the ground surface, so that's no-till, direct planting of seeds, not tilling up all those mycorrhizal fungi and disturbing the bacteria in the soil. It's maintaining a permanent ground cover, that's cover crops. So if you remember one thing today, remember this: don't farm naked. Always keep the land covered. That's how you actually produce those exudates. It's how you recruit beneficial organisms in the soil, and retaining crop residues is a way to do that as well. For your guys' industry, it's what you do in between your vines. And diversifying crop rotations. Again, you may have a hard time doing that in a vineyard, but it's all about what happens in between your vines. That's where you would get your diversity. And why is that important? Because it can help break up pathogen carryover. If you think from the context of a corn farmer, for example, if you plant corn in the same field every year, what you've done is you've basically ensured that the corn pests that are guaranteed to show up the first year that you plant corn, their offspring will be born into a grocery store. This is not what you want. You want to diversify things. So diversifying in between your guys' crops would be the way to get that diversity in. Now I'll share with you just a couple farmers that I visited in writing Growing a Revolution. This gentleman here is Dwayne Beck. He runs Dakota Lakes Research Farm in South Dakota. He works with very large-scale farmers, up to 20,000-acre farms. He's doing this at scale. This is not a boutique, small-scale farm kind of a thing that he's doing. And he basically started to going no-till back in the 70s or 80s, I forget. This is why you write it down in a book so you don't have to remember these things. He then moved into growing cover crops. He then diversified his rotations to be complex. And what he's basically been able to do is figure out a system that works for these farmers that are mostly growing corn, wheat, and soybeans, a way to essentially cut their diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide bills by about 50%. Now, what are the big expenses on these guys' farms? Diesel, fertilizer, and pesticides, and patented seeds. They're now trying to figure out whether or not they need the GMO seeds after they've rebuilt the fertility of their soil. So they've cut their expenses greatly. What happened to their yields? What happened to their income? Well, check out the numbers. Their soybean yield went up from 63 bushels an acre to 79 in the year that I was there. Their corn yields went up by about 8% as well. In other words, it's not a trade-off between yield and health or even profitability. The things that were better for the land actually saved them money and made their farms more profitable. This is why these methods have been taking off in the area where Dwayne's figured out how to tailor them to their land and to their cropping systems. When I left his place, I said, basically, Dwayne, you're working on these large North American farms that have the benefit of modern technology. Could the basic ideas behind what you're doing work on subsistence farms in Africa? And he said, don't ask me that. Why don't you go to Africa and ask somebody who's a subsistence farmer in Africa? And so I went to visit this gentleman up on the screen now, Kofi Boa. Notice his hat, got dirt, get soil. That's the mantra, right? He runs the No-Till Center for researching near Kumasi, Ghana, so it's equatorial West Africa. The farmers he works with, you'd fit 3 of their farms into this room that we're in. These are small-scale subsistence farmers. They do not have access to technology, and there's a reason that the Green Revolution passed them by. They don't have money to buy fertilizer. They don't have money to buy patented seeds. They barely have money to buy a little bit of herbicide that they use to control certain weeds that they get. He basically taught them to go from their traditional slash and burn style of agriculture, where you would cut down a patch of forest, burn it, farm it for 2 years, then let the forest come back and rebuild the fertility of the land over a few decades. Well, what happens when your population gets big enough that you have to farm every scrap of land every year with those methods? You take soil organic matter from 4 or 5% in the jungle down to less than 1%, and all of a sudden you can barely feed yourself. He taught them how to go back to skip the Green Revolution and go to no-till with cover crops. They get their diversity into their system because they have 8 crops growing in their fields all at once. It's kind of like a diverse cover crop mix, but they eat everything. What happened to erosion? They shut that down by a factor of 20. And what happened to their yields? Well, look at the numbers. Their corn yields tripled, their cowpea yields doubled. That's as good as the Green Revolution did. This is without fertilizers, without chemicals, without them spending money. It's about changing the way they think about their soil so that they're actually prioritizing practices that build healthy, fertile soil rather than paying someone else to buy products that degrade the fertility of their land over time. It worked for them. This gentleman is David Brandt. He runs Brandt Family Farm near Carroll, Ohio. He grows wheat, corn, and soybeans for the North American commodity crop markets. And notice that he's modeling that tillage radish there. He's standing in a field of cover crops. I think he had 12 different species in that field that year. Notice his neighbor's field in the background, the sort of yellow late season soybeans. The green stuff in that field in the background are glyphosate-resistant weeds. They've been sprayed 3 times that year. You cannot kill them. They are a yield drag on his neighbor's performance. And David was basically kind enough to walk me through sort of what he did. And he gets his diversity in not from the crops he's selling, but from the cover crops he grows in between his cash crops. And his neighbors, the numbers up there on the screen now are what the county average that he talked me through for his neighbors, where they're doing full tillage, they're using 200 pounds of nitrogen an acre, 2.5 quarts of Roundup. The cost for them for doing that's $500 an acre. They were getting about 100 bushels an acre in 2015, the year I visited. They were only getting $4 a bushel for their corn. You do the math. They were losing $100 an acre. They would have been better off planting a single pumpkin, selling it for Halloween, and going to Mexico for the rest of the year. Instead, they worked hard all year to lose more money. And there's something seriously wrong with an agronomic system if people on some of the best farmland in the world who are really hardworking people, the harder they work, the more money they lose. And I verified this. There's a peer-reviewed study that came out about neighboring Iowa in the same year. 24% of farmers in that state in that year lost more than $100 an acre on their corn. This is a systemic problem. What about David Brandt? He's been doing no-till for 44 years. He's been doing cover crops for close to 20. He has his diversity through his cover crop mixes. He's not tilling, so he saves diesel right out of the gate by about 50%. He's using about 1/8 of the nitrogen. He's using 1 quart of Roundup an acre. He's not an organic farmer. He probably would have hit me if I called him an organic farmer. So I called him an organic-ish farmer. And we got along really well. He had so reduced his chemical use, he could almost get certified, but he doesn't want it. It's not what he does. He was only spending $320 an acre when his neighbors were spending $500. He was harvesting 80% more than the county average because he had rebuilt the health and fertility of his soil. So at that same $4 a bushel price point, he was making $400 an acre. He was incredibly profitable when his hardworking neighbor right next door was just hemorrhaging money. This is what turned me into an optimist. Because if these methods of conservation agriculture can actually work to so reduce the input costs for farmers and not negatively impact their yields, that's a recipe for wider adoption. So why did it work for David? This is the soil he had in 1971 up on the right, the soil he has now on the left. Doesn't that look a lot like what happened in our yard? He did it on a full-scale operational farm with conventional agriculture. He was not an organic farmer. And he did it on a time scale that was roughly comparable to what Ann did in our yard. This can work at scale on a real farm. The last guy they'll share with you is Gabe Brown. He is actually bringing livestock back into the equation as well, so he's practicing conservation agriculture with those three principles, but he's also bringing these, what I call self-propelled methane digesters, back into the equation to graze off his cover crops. And actually, to graze off his cover crops, he'll bring them in after he harvests a cash crop. He brings in the cows and the chickens to graze off the cover crop. They then leave their manure in that same spot. And what they've basically done is they've basically taken those crops, processed them, and inoculated them with microbia, and then put them back into the soil. So how has that worked for him? The soil he's holding up in his right hand there is from that field I just showed you, where he's been using the cows and the chickens in addition to the conservation agriculture principles for a few years. The soil in his, and that one has close to 10% organic matter. It's like the best on his ranch. Soil in his left hand, that's his neighbor's organic farm. What's wrong with his neighbor's organic farm? They till too much. Tillage limits your ability to increase the rate of the amount of carbon you put in the soil. How does this all relate to carbon farming? All these color differences between khaki and dark chocolate brown. The difference is organic matter, which is 50% carbon. The more organic matter you can build in the soil, the more carbon you've put in the soil. And if your practices can keep it there, it can make a big difference. So basically, Ann and I summarized, what is the recipe for building organic matter and restoring fertility to the world's farmlands? Ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. Go to no-till or minimal disturbance. Minimal tillage can work really well as well. No-till works better in terms of carbon. Keeping the ground covered with cover crops and grow more than 3 or 4 crops in a rotation or on a field. And there's this is not a question of organic versus conventional. It's about how to actually apply an understanding of soil ecology to the applied problem of increasing yields by decreasing inputs. And that is the other kinds of benefits that you can gain from this. It can help restore farm profitability. It can help feed the world in terms of yields sustainably. We can put carbon in the ground, and it can reduce off-site impacts of things like nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers because we don't need to use so many of them. The final thing that I'll do before I touch a little bit on wine is that we're basically poised, I think, now for what I call the 5th agricultural revolution, which is one that prioritizes practices that are based on building soil health. It's a very different way to look at things than the conventional versus organic lens that we almost always look at it through, because farmers like Gabe Brown and David Brandt are not organic farmers, and their soil is way better than their organic neighbors. It's because of the system of practices they've used. And who are the key players there? It's the microbes. You think about what is the recipe for building microbial abundance and diversity of the beneficial microbes in the soil. It's don't disturb them, feed them, and give them a community to work with. That's ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity right there, which is the 180-degree opposite of what we've taught in agronomy for the last 100 years. This is a new way of thinking about how the soil plays into farming. How does this all relate to the wine world? Well, essentially, we used to think that terroir was related to climate and soil. That is so out of date. It's about the microbes, which of course are related to climate and soil and geology, right? All the things that we think go into terroir. But there's been a lot of work that has started to appear in the journals now about how the specifics of where you are in the landscape, the microclimate, even microclimates on a particular vineyard are affecting the microbes that both live in the rhizosphere around the roots of your plants and also on your grapes, and that carry on through to the winemaking process. Understanding the role of microbial ecology is not just important for rebuilding soil organic matter, it's important for understanding every step of the wine production process. And by way of illustrating that, these are just illustrations from a couple of recent papers that show sort of where the microbial abundance and diversity comes into play around your roots, on your leaves, on your fruit, carrying on into your fermentation process. And it's really, I think, probably more accurate today to basically argue that terroir is a microbial phenomenon. It's basically the outcome of those microbes in the contingencies of your climate, your geology, your practices. But there's one other element that I'll identify as affecting that, and that is that your agronomic practices in the vineyard affects the microbiome of your plants and what's getting into your wine. This paper up here, the Vineyard Yeast Microbiome Mixed Model Microbial Map paper, notice that the quote on there is actually probably worth reading. The data demonstrate that farming systems have a significant impact on fungal diversity, but more importantly, there's a significant species heterogeneity between samples in the same vineyard. Cultivation-based methods confirmed that while the same oxidative yeast species dominated in all vineyards, the least treated, the least sprayed vineyards displayed significantly higher species richness, including many yeasts with biocontrol potential. In other words, how you actually operate your vineyard affects what you're going to have in terms of the fungal community on your vines. This shows you a principal component-based analysis from that same paper, but basically note what it, forget sort of what the axes are. It's basically showing you that the green stuff is different than the blue stuff is different than the red stuff. They all plot in different corners, right? What's the difference? Green is biodynamic, conventional is red, and sort of integrated pest management kind of farming is shown in blue. Notice the big difference between conventional and biodynamic. There's real differences that actually play through in terms of the fungal communities. And the last slide I'll show you on this basically relates to that from that same data set, just the diversity of different species, how abundant they are. The yellow stripe there, that shows you that in a conventional system, the species list runs out about halfway down that graph. The purple thing on the right goes all the way down to the bottom. You've got a more diverse and rich fungal community in the biodynamic system, and the integrated one is kind of comparable to conventional in this case. My point being, is that we're kind of at a new day in terms of understanding what goes into growing wheat, corn, soybeans, wine grapes, what then gets into your bottles, in terms of thinking about microbial abundance. And I think a big piece that's going to help drive this in terms of interest in regenerative farming practices is consumer awareness. There's that study of glyphosate in California wines from a couple of years back where there was glyphosate in every bottle they sampled, including the organic ones. As the studies on what glyphosate does to the human microbiome start to come online, there's going to be increasing demand for this. Things we could do to decrease herbicide use are going to be a marketplace advantage in the future. So I'd like to just leave you with this happy slide of thinking about the relationship between the soil, your vines, the wine that people like I enjoy. We need to think about the microbial ecology as the big part of the foundation for that. What's going on in the soil is a big piece of that. And if you're interested in the details of that, I brought books along. I've got a table over in the corner once we're done, and hopefully I haven't burned up all our time, and we can deal with a few questions.
Got plenty of time for questions.
Oh, good.
Thank you, David. If anybody has questions, you can send in a question on the app. I have a couple already coming through. And if you don't have the app and you want to ask a question, is there microphones out in the audience? You can come up and ask. We'll field questions from the floor also. But to start, the first question I had was, if adopting conservation no-till ag, how would you suggest combating soil compaction due to spray and canopy management equipment? And I think we're going to direct this either to Carl or to Corey.
So I think one of the things that, and you could probably comment on this as well, if you are continuously tilling and depleting that soil organic matter from your soil, those types of resultant soils are going to be more prone to compaction. So as you're starting to build your soil back up, there are things that we necessarily have to do, spraying and the more we mechanize, running more equipment through. But if you set yourself up for having those more resilient soils, especially if you have cover on the soils all year, that's going to reduce the risk, I think, necessarily.
I would just add that anytime you're adding organic matter to soil, you're increasing the strength of the soil. So over time, as you're adjusting your practices and reducing disturbance, and you're building organic matter, your soil is going to get stronger. It's going to be able to withstand the equipment better. And also just obviously timing and when you have the equipment out there is critical. Obviously you have windows when you have to spray, but if you have that cover on there, it'll armor it and it'll protect it and it'll increase the building while you're doing that.
The next question I had is ripping deep into new vineyard plantings a good idea or a bad idea? Talking about establishing a new vineyard.
I won't pretend to answer that for New Vineyard because I would probably give my usual, well, it depends on the context. But what I will tell you about with our yard, when we'd pulled that old growth lawn off, I think it would have, in hindsight, been a great idea to rip that down about 2 or 3 feet, just break it up, and then never disturb it again. So I can see circumstances in which something like that might be good, but I would defer to the particular circumstances of a particular place as to whether it was a good idea.
Yeah, we had the fortune to work on a lot of the PPV sites, and there had been a lot of deep ripping multiple ways. So that was way back in the day, and I was talking to Francisco about what we typically had done, as Atlas had done in some of those same sites but different development phases, and they'd actually reduce the depth, but they still thought that was an effective practice. The one thing that we have noticed is that if you have clay layers that are pretty thick and are maybe 3-4 feet down, I think you'd expect that even if you rip through those, they're just going to come right back together. So if you're starting to get crops that are cover crops and diversity that are able to start working their way down, you might mitigate some of that as well.
Yeah, I'd say if you're starting a new vineyard, you're going to want to dig a lot of holes and see what you've got and see what your soil horizons are, check out your soil maps and see what kind of practices were used before. And if you've got compaction, I'm definitely a proponent of what I call a big intervention to set you up for long-term success. So if you're going to get the ripper out there, you need to have a plan for what you're going to do the minute the ripper's done. And that means planting a crop with like a deep-rooted fibrous root structure that's going to get in there and make that ripping worth it, and the cost of that actually have a lasting effect, because if you rip over and over again, you're just speeding your soil up and it's just going to get more and more compacted even if you do it every year. So if you want to go in there and rip because it looks like the soil that you are starting a new vineyard on is degraded, then have a plan that's more than just getting the ripper out there.
The next question is, what are your thoughts on creating these healthy vineyard soils versus the feeling that vines need to struggle to make good wines?
I had the pleasure of speaking at the International Biodynamic Wine Conference a couple of years ago, and there was a gentleman who had taken a winery in the south of France from really crappy soil to really good soil. I was blown away by his wine. It was incredible. Now, I'm probably the wrong guy to ask that question to, but that N=1 experience suggests to me that there's room for healthy soils and good wine.
I've been thinking recently a lot about, we do have excess vigor and we do want to promote stress among our vines to give the wineries the fruit that they want. But I think there might be an opportunity in a no-till system if the assumption is, oh, you're going to get too much vigor. Well, you can always change your cover crop to something more competitive. And if we're being good stewards of the land and monitoring what the vigor is doing, what the vines are doing, if you feel like you're getting too much competition, you could potentially no-till drill in some cover crops to feed that cover crop to maintain the balance. And what is stress? I mean, what moderate stress? Okay, that's something that I think there's a range on that. And again, we need to be no-till conventional, whatever we're doing, we need to be monitoring that, especially in light of the trunk disease issues. Because if you don't have a resilient system and you stress stuff out too much, then you may get the fruit quality you want, but you get it for that 1 year and then you start losing vines. So I think reevaluating what the range and what the meaning of stress is something that's pretty important.
It's particularly important for producing things like polyphenols in crops. They'll basically make them in response to interaction with soil life, and if you don't have soil life, they don't tend to they'll make different ones or not as many of them.
And then the next question I got was kind of tied into that same question. It's what's the best way to rotate cover crops without tilling them in? And I think Carl touched on that by using a no-till seed drill would be the best way to do it. There are several soil and water conservation districts that own no-till seed drills and do lease them out to people within the district, and then also they'll go across county lines too. I know for our area in the Willamette Valley, I think it's Washington County has one. And it's a 3-foot wide no-till seed drill, so that would work pretty good for some of our tighter spaced vineyards. Yamhill County has a little bit wider one that I don't think would fit down any of our vine rows unless you have a much older vineyard. But hopefully we'll start seeing places like OVS and other equipment places renting no-till seed drills instead of the conventional seed drills that we've been seeing from those places.
Yeah, and we've got quite, I think, a couple at Atlas, and we're probably going to get more. So I'm super stoked about that because it's going to make cover crop seeding a lot easier this year. But one thing I will say about like what's a good strategy to get rotations and select species based for your site. I've had that question asked to me by several people looking to pursue converting over to no-till or reduced tillage, and there's not a lot of information out there that I've seen, and even less specific to vineyards. NRCS is a good resource, but I think we really need to start seeing some research done in this area. Like, okay, if this is valid, then let's test those assumptions. Let's set up some trials, compare it to conventional, compare it to reduced, compare it to no-till, and then the data is going to tell us. I mean, I don't know why we would expect the outcomes to be different here if the assumptions are valid that erosion occurs when you don't have cover on your fields. But that's something we can validate, and I think it's worth pursuing.
I would just add that whenever anyone asks me for a cover crop recommendation, be it a vineyard, an orchard, a grass seed field, or a pasture, I have to say, let's go have a cup of coffee and let's take 4 years and let me get your life philosophy, because growing cover crop is more than just an agronomic practice, it's a lifestyle. And so you really have to understand what you want your cover crop to do, what kind of equipment you have to manage your cover crop, your capacity to deal with the residue. And sure, in vineyards, it's going to be even more complicated because you have things like harvest and equipment access and stress and that sort of stuff. So when you think about cover crops, I think, if you have that inquisitive mind and you want to tinker, those are the folks like that Dr. Montgomery was talking about, those guys who, they didn't just wake up one morning and have those soil health management systems. They really worked hard and trying things out in small areas and figuring out what's going to work. So when it comes to cover crop establishment and then adding diversity to your cover crop, you really got to just think about what you would do and how you want to play with it. And there are a lot of resources out there, even though there may not be vineyard specific. Western SARE is an organization, part of USDA, that has a book called Growing Cover Crops Profitably, which is free. You can download the PDF. It's Western SARE. What is that? Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. It's part of USDA. And there's a lot of OSU, more and more OSU extension publications on growing cover crops. And we have a plant materials center in Corvallis, Oregon, who's actually starting to do some cover crop work in vineyards. We just put in some trials recently, so we're trying to get that research going.
If anybody has a question out there, Bree has a microphone over here, and she'd be more than happy to bring it over to you.
So we have a dry farm vineyard. And what would you say to somebody who says that if we leave the cover crop on all year long, it will be too much competition for the vines? It will draw them down, and they will struggle and not be able to make it, and that's why we have to till.
How many years is that? Do you have a permanent cover crop currently, or you're?
No, we don't. We're thinking about establishing it, but we established our vineyard 5 years ago. And people are saying you can't leave a cover crop on all year. You know, it'll be too hard on your vines.
I can't give you an answer on, from the wine world, but I can give you an answer from some of the semi-arid places that I've looked in sort of other crops, where what they've found is that by not tilling, they're actually getting more water infiltration down into the soil. Their net water retention in the soil goes up even though the cover crops are using it. So I'm sure that would play into it, but I've been surprised that some of the farmers I looked at in the Dakotas had, after adopting cover crops, had basically stopped irrigating. That saved them a ton of money.
I just recently came back from Bicines, and they had a vineyard that was established there, and they get 12 inches of rain, and the cover crop they put in prior to establishing the vineyard, it was that tall. So then they had that, and previously they had some compost. So they were able to get a lot of biomass. And what does that translate into? Well, if you're just growing a bunch of clover, that's going to break down really quickly because it's a lot of water and nitrogen. But if you had the diversity in there like that, that's, as you said, you want to get a lot of diversity in there. Make your C to N ratio such that, depending on what your goal is, you're going to either have it stick around and help with building soil organic matter slowly, or maybe your goal is that you want it to break down really quickly if you're in a development phase and you want to get the nitrogen available a little bit more quickly. But it's really tailoring it to what the goal is, and then using the research to find out what's going to work.
Okay, I think we're right about at time unless someone has a burning question out there. Kevin?
What about cultivation during the establishment phase?
Well, that same place that I just mentioned, they were no-till from the get-go, and they didn't have an issue with the vines developing. They were, I believe, they might have been irrigating once the vines were in the ground, but prior to that, they hadn't done any irrigation. And I think that would also depend on what the soil treatment had been prior to development. So if you were going into a situation with a degraded soil, it'd be a struggle, I would guess.
And if anybody would like to pick up a book, I'll be back in the corner.
Thanks so much.